my friends, and a very warm welcome back to my painting channel. And in this video I'm going to show you how to take photographs of your miniatures, giving you an idea of how to be a little bit more creative with your photography, and also an idea as to how to get your photos to really pop. Now, for those of you that don't know me, outside of painting miniatures, my full-time job actually is a portrait photographer, so I take photographs for a living. So I'm just kind of hoping to give you guys a little bit of a breakdown as to how I take photos of my minis, and maybe this will help you out. So all I'm using for this is a simple light box, a phone, a slightly more advanced camera, and a tripod. This light box is very cheap and easy to find. I found this one on Amazon, and it's just a nice straightforward plug-in USB light box. So we're going to start with the basics. With the basics we're going to use an old iPhone 7 Plus, and I'm just going to show you kind of the basics of how to take photos using this light box with a straightforward phone. So all we're going to do is we're just going to use the camera on the phone, no filters, no adjustments, no nothing. So this is just going to be a straightforward basic shoot. So as you can see, I've got the grid set to the camera, and the grid will allow me to keep the subject in the center of my focus. Why that's important is because the center of your lens is the clearest and sharpest area of your camera. So when you're taking photographs, if you keep your subject in the middle of your lens, that will give you the best results. And now, as you can see, that's all I'm doing is keeping the camera nice and steady, keeping the camera nice and straight towards the miniature, so that we're roughly around about the miniature's level, so we're pointing straight at it. I'm then tapping on the area that I want the focus to be, and then I'm just slightly dragging the little lighting part down on the side. So basic stuff. So it's just picking my focus point, picking how light or dark I want the photo, and then just tapping the button. And as you can see, each time I tap the button, I'm just showing you the still photo here, just like so, just to give you an idea. Now with a phone, something that I would tend to avoid is zooming in, especially zooming in too much. With a mobile phone, unless you have a fancy one that has multiple lenses, zooming in becomes a digital zoom, and so you don't tend to have the same level of detail. Normally this is okay if you're using something like a light box, because using natural light or a nice bright light will counteract that. But generally I tend to, as you can see here, use or take the photograph wide out, keeping the subject in the center, and then just adjusting that light and dark. So as you can see, to get this to have a really cool dark effect, I focused on the base, which is white, and that will tone the colors down. So that's basic photography, that's basic stuff, just taking photos with your phone. So something nice and straightforward, nice and simple. Moving on to something a little bit more advanced, and using a little bit more of an advanced piece of kit. So we're using a slightly higher grade camera here. This is a micro four thirds camera, so this isn't a really big sort of DSLR or anything like that, but it does have all the same principles. And the reason why I'm going to show you on this is because the screen will allow me to give you a little bit more of an idea of how I control a lot of the settings. So as you can see here, trying to do things when you have a cat is a nightmare. Trying to take photographs and make videos when you have a very curious little cat, it can be quite challenging and also quite entertaining. Now on this one, what we're going to do is we're going to focus a little bit here just for a second on something called ISO. And with a slightly more advanced camera, you have something on here where you get to control your ISO range. And ISO, without going too far into detail, just means how clear and how sharp your images come out. So the lower the number, the sharper your images. The higher the number, the more grainy your images, which means that they don't have the same clarity or the same sharpness to your photographs. So ideally what you want to try and do is keep your ISO range nice and low, especially if you're using certain types of cameras or slightly older types of cameras. So as an example, with this particular camera, if I'm using an ISO of about 1600 or lower, that tends to do quite well. Some cameras are more advanced, but this one is a little bit older now. So ideally you want to keep your ISO nice and low. Now from there I'm also going to show you, as you can see, I'm just adjusting on the camera. So I'm just scrolling with my thumb, and on the left hand side you can see the number going up. this number is called shutter speed, and shutter speed means when you're taking your photographs, it means how fast the shutter takes the photograph. Now with a more advanced camera like this one, if you're taking your photographs, anything sort of below about 80, so that number on the left hand side, if that's anything lower than 80, you might find that the photographs will blur, or you might get a little bit of drag, so you kind of need to use a tripod for anything lower than 80. Again, this is company and model dependent, but generally rule of thumb, anything below 80 and I would use a tripod. My most go-to without a tripod would be 125 or higher, and that will all depend on your lighting. Now the number next to that as well is your f-stop. As you can see, it says f5. Now with your slightly more advanced cameras, ideally what you want to try and do is keep your number high enough that you don't blur the edges of your model or your miniature. Now the lower your number goes, the softer that edge can be, because what you're doing is you're making your focus or your depth of field much more narrow. Now when you're taking photographs of miniatures especially, because you're quite close to the miniature, this means if you use a low number, that will allow not just the background to blur, but also parts of your miniature to blur as well. So I recommend anything between f5 to f8 would be around about perfect on taking photos of miniatures while keeping all areas in focus. Now I know this is a lot to go through, but it is a basic sort of three-prong system. So you've got your ISO nice and low, your shutter speed depending on whether you have a tripod or not, depends on whether you want to use it at 125 or if you want to use it at lower than 80. And then your aperture, so the lower the number, the more blurred out your background, but sometimes also the more blurred out your model. And as you can see, that's all I'm doing here, is I'm just playing about on the back of the camera with some of the focus points. And if you remember what I said on the phone in the basic area, ideally you want to keep your model in the middle, because the central part of your lens is always the clearest and sharpest part of your lens. So that's pretty much as easy and as simple as I can make sort of this triple set. Now I'm going to move on slightly and give you just a small idea as to how the principles will work when put together. So we're going to take a few photographs on this camera just to give you an idea and to show you kind of how that background will blur. So as you can see, I'm focusing, keeping my models in the center, and there's your photo. So this one, as you can see, the ghost in the background is quite blurred out, so that means we've used an aperture that's quite low. So I'm on f4 here, meaning that the background is blurring more, so the ghost behind is quite blurry. Now what we're going to do is we're going to put our f-stop up, but by doing so we need to bring our shutter speed down. And when we take this photograph at f10, you can see that the ghost behind now is becoming a lot clearer. So he's becoming a little bit sharper. And this is kind of the principles and how aperture works, especially when taking photographs of miniatures. Because with miniatures, you're so close to them, and they're so close to the backgrounds and things like that, that sometimes those f-stops don't translate like they would if you were taking photographs of people, as an example. So here I'm taking a photograph looking down, and I focused on the base. So it translates here that the base is in focus, but the top of the miniature is blurred out. And this is kind of what you get. This is why I suggest normally when taking photographs of miniatures to keep the camera in line with them, pointing straight at them, because this kind of slows down or stops you from blurring parts of your miniature that maybe you don't want to. So we're going to move on just slightly, and using those exact same principles, we're going to get a little bit more creative here. So I've just set up a small little display here, again in my light box. That's all I have is a survivor from The Walking Dead, surrounded by a few zombies from multiple different games. And I've just stood him on a homemade little rock outcrop that I've made, and pretty much we're going to move just behind and take a look at what that means using those settings on the camera. So as you can see, everyone's set up here on the display, and I'm going to keep, as you can see, our survivor is in the center of the he's in the center of the lens, so he's going to be in the sharpest area, and this will allow me then, as you can see, to blur the guys in front and also the guys behind, creating a little bit more of a a story, so this creates a more creative photograph, something that's a little bit more pleasing on the eye, something that's a little bit more interesting to look at. So instead of just taking a photograph of a model on a black background, this is the kind of thing that you can do to step that photography up and to step up the creativity of how you take your photos. These principles and all these principles still work outside as well, so you can use these outside using little bits of foliage and all things like that. But in summary, I have a few little bullet points for you. Number one, always clean your lens. It is hugely important to make sure that your lenses are clean, especially with your phone, because it's always in your pocket. Number two is the center focus is your sharpest point, so keep your model in the middle of your picture, and then you can always crop around it. Number three, make sure to keep your ISO count low. The lower it is, the clearer and sharper your image is without any grain or noise. Number four, use a tripod when shooting at low shutter speed. So if the lighting isn't so good and you have to tone your lighting down, make sure to use a tripod to make sure that you don't get that motion or blur. Number five, use white light or natural light where you can. The lighting in your house is orange and it won't have the same effect. Number six, blur your backgrounds using that aperture. So that f-stop, the f5, f8, f10, the lower that number, the more you blur your backgrounds. And as always, my friends, thank you so much for tuning in and watching. Thank you for your support. Thank you for your comments. I really hope that this video gives you an idea and helps you on your photography journey. As always, thank you, and I will see you on the next one.